Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Amber Wilkins, the Allied and Public Health CPD Coordinator here at Piedmont AHEC. Welcome to today's educational activity, Equity in Infant Feeding and Family Health, Lactation in Diverse Families, Chest Feeding, Queer Families, Accessibility. This course is being offered in partnership with Breastfeed Durham. And a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. By attending today's program, you are granting permission for Piedmont AHEC to record audio and video, which we keep on file for the purposes of verifying attendance only. Information regarding your attendance may be shared with various accrediting bodies if such information is requested. No members of the faculty or planning committee have disclosed any financial relationships with ineligible companies. This continuing education activity did not receive any commercial supports, educational grants, or in-kind support. Please rename yourself in Zoom by locating the three dots beside your profile box, selecting rename, and typing in your first and last name, as well as typing your first and last name into the chat box for attendance verification. Within the next 24 hours after the conclusion of today's program, you will receive an email with instructions on how to complete the course evaluation. Upon completion of the evaluation, you can request your certificate of completion. And now we begin with our presenter bios. Kai Kennedy, they, them, is a mother, disability advocate, lactation consultant, and published author. They take pride in their passion to both advocate for a more accessible and inclusive society and implement these same practices into their lactation services. With their combined lived and professional experience in queer and disability spaces, Kai brings a unique lens through which they provide lactation care. After struggling to nurse their own daughter, Kai committed to documenting their story and others just like it. Their book, Sweet Nectar, hopefully everything you want to know about chest feeding, provides insight into the many struggles that parents face when learning to feed their baby human milk, highlighting the not so unique but rarely told stories. And Kai, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you so much for having me here and for reading my bio for me. You read that beautifully. You have a very nice reading voice. So I am going to go ahead and pull up my slide deck and share my screen. And I also am feeding my baby right now. So if you hear some some baby noises, I've got a baby here as well. All right, let's do slideshow and share screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. I'll make it full screen as well. Okay. Go dada. Okay. All right. So I've titled this presentation An Introduction to Lactation Through a Disability Lens. Again, as stated, my name is Kai Kennedy. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a certified breastfeeding specialist. So to start, some photos of my babies. We have my two twin girls I just had about 3 months ago, Avery and Amelia, and then my singleton, Aubrey, who is now 5 years old.
Kai, before you move on, it still says loading. I
Oh,
don't know if
goodness.
it says that on your end as well.
Let's see. It does not. So let me see if I can. Okay, how's that? Still say loading?
It does.
Okay. Let's see if I can do the PDF version, if that might be easier. Gotta love technology. All right, let's try PDF. I just may not be able to do full screen, but that's okay. All right. Screen share. Okay. How's that?
We can see it.
Okay. How about if I switch slides? Can you see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So we'll do it this way. And if anybody needs me to make it a little bit bigger, please just let me know. But that should work for now. So again, some photos of my babies. My twins I just had 3 months ago, and then my singleton Aubrey, she is 5. And my twins are Avery and Amelia. So a little bit about me. You guys heard my bio already, but I am a mother of three, an author. My book, Sweet Nectar, hopefully everything you want to know about chest feeding, is my first and only book, but I'm very proud of it. I'm also a certified breastfeeding specialist and have been for the past 4.5 years almost now, going on 5, and a disability advocate. I have a nonprofit organization called Autistics Unmasked. We are an entirely autistic ran nonprofit organization. I also work for local government as a training and accessibility inclusion or training and inclusion specialist, where I create different courses on how to really just make the world more accessible for folks with disabilities of all kinds. And I've also given a TEDx speak or talk on my experience as a Black autistic woman living in the United States. Okay, so a quick what to expect. We're going to go through kind of past, present, future of me, some relevant information for healthcare professionals, and kind of some next steps. So we'll do a brief summary of my book and my personal nursing experience and the things that I ran into, where I am now as far as disability advocacy and how those two things kind of intertwine for me. And then, like I said, some calls to action, ways that you can make care more accessible. Okay, so past. Again, here's a copy or a photo of the cover of my book. It was illustrated by my sister, and she's very proud of that. I'm very proud of her for being able to capture this idea for me. So the birth of my oldest was in April of 2019. She is affectionately known as my little butterfly or my petite papillon in French. And so the idea for sweet nectar came from nectar being something that butterflies feed off of. She was, chest fed, so that my milk being her nectar. Hopefully that connects for everyone. But we had a very difficult experience, a very difficult journey that started with a NICU stay that was short, but very traumatic, and then kind of led into some difficulties due to oral ties, which is something that I then moved on to kind of committing my practice to being able to specialize in more or less, because I realized that oral ties, so tongue ties, lip ties, and cheek ties, are something that really does get in the way of nursing your child. It's not, and it's not just an issue with nursing, it kind of follows them throughout life and can cause issues later on down the road as well. So, going through that struggle is kind of what prompted me to want to become some sort of lactation professional. And I ended up seeking out an organization in Baltimore. We were living in Baltimore at the time, who sponsored me to, they gave me a scholarship to attend a lactation education resources online to become a certified breastfeeding specialist. So I did that, and then kind of launched my career, so to speak, and published my book shortly after. So that's a very brief history of kind of where Sweet Nectar came from. I realized that so many parents had similar struggles to me, specifically around just not having the proper amount of support. We were speaking right before we let all the participants in about just like needing support. Like it makes a world of a difference. With my firstborn, I pretty sure I did not leave the house for like 6 months, but now with my twins, I was out and ready to be in the world a week later, and I went back to a week a home or went back to work a whole month early, and it was really because the amount of support that I had from family and friends and the community that we live in was just incredible. And I also saw some really awesome, lactation specialists after giving birth to them because the same way that doctors need doctors and therapists need therapists, lactation consultants also need lactation consultants. So that was a huge thing for me. And then kind of moving forward into that, and around 2021, April 2021, so about 2 years after I had my daughter, I discovered that I'm autistic. And that was something that was a very eye-opening thing to come to realization. It was not a very easy one. It actually came after my younger sister realized that she was autistic, and as funny as it is, my youngest brother was diagnosed when he was about I want to say 6 years old or so. So it is something that runs in families. Many people don't know that. And so after my sister went to kind of discover herself as an autistic woman, then I kind of went on to do the same thing and realized that there were a lot of traits that I identified with and wondered if, maybe I might be autistic. So I sought out a diagnosis from a neuropsych doctor, and it was confirmed that I am autistic. And in addition to that, I was also discovering my physical disabilities. I've had a lot of kind of mobility and joint pain for a huge, really, for as long as I can remember, a huge portion of my life. At the earliest, I remember, being in middle school and having these issues. But I was always told it was like growing pains and things like that. After getting my autism diagnosis, the doctor who diagnosed me suggested that I go on to see a geneticist to confirm what she suspected was Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a common co-occurring condition for a lot of autistic people. Many of them also have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I went on to get to seek out a geneticist who did confirm I do in fact have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which also contributed to some of the complications I had in both of my pregnancies, where my cervix started to shorten around 22 weeks. And that's a fairly common thing for a lot of folks who have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So all of these things kind of tied together for me. Towards the end of 2021-ish, where I really, was kind of immersing myself in autistic culture, immersing myself in what it really meant for an accessible world after, learning about my physical disabilities and giving myself a little bit more grace. It's not just growing pains or mystery ailments. Like there's a legitimate reason for why I'm in so much pain. For the majority of my life, I kind of live at a chronic pain level of about a 5 or a 6. So when I go to the doctor and they say, what's your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10, I can't really do that because I live in like a 6 range. So it was definitely very eye-opening and helpful for me to learn about these things because then I was able to, take my own experiences, my lived experiences, and apply them to whenever I, met with a parent or a parent to be, and they were struggling with or wanted to know more about lactation. I had several of them come to me who were also autistic and had some sort of, sensory avoidant or sensory, sensitivity. So I was able to apply my lived experience that way. And so that's a, kind of very condensed, as long-winded as that might have sounded, that was a very condensed version of kind of my discovery into what disability means for me. And so now that brings us to the present. So I mentioned already, these few things that I am the CEO and co-founder of a nonprofit organization that I've given a TEDx talk here in Boston, where I live, and I also work for local government as a training specialist to give courses similar to this one. In addition to many others, there's some information actually pulled from my courses that I will be going into in the next part of my presentation. And I also kind of partner with other folks who are, running for office and things like that. This is a photo here of me and my friend Lisa, who just recently was running for state rep to here in Boston. Unfortunately, she didn't win her election, but that's okay. She still is out there doing advocacy. And Lisa is also an autistic woman, and so her campaign was really about spreading more education around autism and allowing folks to kind of immerse themselves in the reality that it's not, autism does not look like how a lot of folks think it does. And so that can kind of create barriers for us in a lot of different places, including lactation, including healthcare. And so this was at one of the rallies that I spoke at for Lisa. That's my service dog, Baloo. He's a poodle. He just turned 2 in May, and he's awesome. He's my baby, my lifesaver. And so that kind of is where I am now today is immersing myself in my 9 to 5 job, teaching classes, but also running my nonprofit and doing speaking engagements wherever I can find them so that I can spread more awareness and education about being autistic and about having physical disabilities as well. Okay, so this is the part of the presentation where hopefully you can take a lot of things home. So future, today and beyond, I want some calls of action for you guys. So we're going to talk a little bit about different models of disability as well as different types of languages and things like that for working with disabled folks, as well as just like accessibility in practice. So, figuring out exactly how you can be accessible for everyone. The first thing that I want to talk about is language specifically, especially in procedures and paperwork and the way that you're addressing the parents that you're working with. When we talk about different models of disability, there are two main models, more than two, but two main ones, and that's the medical model and the social model. So the medical model focuses on independence and the individual adapting to society. So that's where you see things like trying to get folks to be able to feed themselves, trying to get folks to be able to dress themselves, trying to get disabled folks to do as many things themselves as they possibly can, despite the fact that they're disabled. It also says that disability is a deficit or an abnormality and focuses on fixing that deficit or that abnormality. Common language that's used with the medical model may be physical impairment, wheelchair bound, low functioning. These kind of reinforce assumptions about someone's abilities based on their disability. And again, only kind of encourages use of person first language, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The social model is kind of where the disability community wants us to go to now. So this emphasizes the value of community and society adapting to disability. So instead of focusing on independence and the individual, saying like, oh, well, why doesn't this person just use a hearing aid? Or why doesn't this person, just stay inside if they have to use a wheelchair? Instead, we look at, okay, can we have some sort of sign language interpreter available? Can we make this a ramp instead of stairs? Can we, have buttons instead of levers to pull? Things like that. Just ways to make things more inclusive and accessible in society as opposed to the other way around. It also emphasizes that disability is a difference and very normal part of human existence. In the disability community, we always say that it is the only thing that does not discriminate. Anybody at any time in their life, no matter what you look like, how old you are, what your gender expression is, your sexuality, your religion, does not matter. Anybody can become disabled at any time. There are people who are born disabled, there are people who acquire disability because of things like car accidents, or maybe they fell off of a horse, or maybe, they had, were in a fire or something of that nature. And then there's disabilities that happen that just come with aging. And so, this is really, it's really hard to say that there's not a single person in this world who will never become disabled, because the reality is it's very likely that everyone in the world at some point in time will become disabled in some way. Um, and it also encourages language like physical disability, wheelchair user, or naming specific support needs, such as this person needs support with dressing or needs support with bathing, things like that, as opposed to how they're functioning. And it gives room for people with disabilities to describe their individual ability and their support needs on their own terms. So when we talk about the different, supports that disabled people need, they're not just a blanket sort of thing. Not every autistic person needs to use headphones in loud places. Not every, person who is blind or low vision can read Braille. Not every person with a physical disability uses a wheelchair. Not every user uses a wheelchair full time. So there's a lot of different things that folks, can assume from somebody based on their disability, especially if they're looking at the medical model. And so that's why the disability community is trying to encourage folks to move more towards the social model. Okay. So before I move on, I do want to give like a little pause here in case there are any questions just on that first little bit, since that was the first kind of chunk where there was, information to actually be taken away from. I don't know, I don't have the access to the chat since this is taken up my screen. But if there are any questions in the chat, or if anybody has one, now is like a good little stopping point before we move on to the next couple of slides.
Hi, I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody does have a question, feel free to come off mute and ask.
Thank you, Amber. Okay. All right. We'll move on to the next couple of slides. So language. I mentioned person first and identity first language. So person first language is when you're putting the person before the disability. So for example, person with autism, person with hearing loss, person with dwarfism. And this language is super common. It comes from this idea that a person is not their disability. However, a lot of disabled folks do feel a close connection with their disability. It is, part of who they are, how they navigate the world, how people perceive them. So sometimes this type of language, person first language, can reinforce the lack of accountability on society's part to remove those systemic barriers and provide more accessible environments. Now, that's not to say that there aren't still some disabled folks who do use person first language. There are plenty who do. But there is kind of a wave or a push for language to move towards identity first language, which is when you acknowledge that a person's identity is a core piece of their identity. So, for example, autistic person, deaf person, little person, instead of the aforementioned. And this language is being adopted by many subsections of the disability community because it encourages accepting disability as a normal part of the human existence. There are, however, some other subgroups, like, for example, folks who have mental health disabilities, such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, things like that. They may differ to person first language and saying, I have bipolar disorder instead of I am bipolar. Whereas specifically, like the autistic community does prefer identity first language and saying autistic person instead of person with autism. But again, this can be subjective. There are people in every community who prefer one over the other. So if you noticed an autistic or otherwise disabled person, using language that is different from what you might expect, follow their lead is what I would say. If they're using person first to describe themselves, then I would continue to use that with them. Whereas if they're using identity first to describe themselves, then follow that lead too. So it may be different from person to person, despite the fact that there are, that there's kind of like a main way that the majority of the community might identify with. Okay. So euphemisms can be a huge barrier to accessible care for disabled people for many reasons. But in short, a euphemism is used or put in place of a word if there's a perceived negative association with that word. So, for example, some folks might be used to using the word handicapable or even handicapped instead of disabled. However, disabled isn't a bad word. It just is. It's a part of life, and it can and should be used. A lot of times, these euphemisms can be patronizing, they can be infantilizing, they can be offensive. And so these are some common ones that you might hear: differently abled, special needs, handicapable, special education, are all terms that can be replaced with disabled or has a disability, the name of the specific need. So again, instead of, like I mentioned in the previous slide, saying that this person, has support needs with dressing or bathing or eating, things like that. And then instead of handicapable, just disabled or has a disability. And when you think about the word like special for special education, special bus, special, things like that, accessible is a word that you can replace that with because there's nothing special about education or places that are accessible. It's just a human right to be able to access these things. And so being disabled doesn't make it, something that's more or less special than any other thing that they might need access to. And some words and phrases, also some things that folks don't even realize are barriers to accessible care. So even when we aren't talking to or about a person with a disability, we can still use language that can be offensive, and maybe heard if they're within earshot or anything of that nature. So things like fall on deaf ears or turn a blind eye or saying that something paralyzed you. These are all things that they stem from an actual disability, and so using them in language that is social language outside of the context of just of a disability can be a negative thing. It can be an offensive thing for a lot of disabled people, and also kind of reiterates a lot of stereotypes. So in on this slide, there's a kind of like a speech bubble with a bunch of different terms, and some of those terms include fall on deaf ears, turn a blind eye, are you blind, having two left feet, things like madhouse, did I stutter, short bus, saying that something is a blind study, or asking someone if they're tone deaf, or saying something drives me insane. These are all things that come from actual disabilities, whether they're mental health disabilities, physical disabilities, visual, et cetera. It's important to kind of have this in the back of your mind when you're using these terms, or when you think you might use those terms, and see if you can, find a replacement for it that does not include using a disability to describe what you're trying to describe. And on this slide, there's two different little tables that have words that are and are not appropriate to use. These are based off of the communities themselves. So specifically, we talked already a little bit about like handicapped, saying that handicapped or handicapped is can be replaced with a person who is disabled or a person with a disability. Also, the our community of deaf and hard of hearing, they don't prefer or they don't like to hear the deaf or hearing impaired. We can just say person who is deaf or person who is hard of hearing. The term midget has been used quite frequently in, media and text and things like that. This term is offensive. I am hoping that people don't use it so much anymore, but instead you can say little person or even a person with dwarfism. There's also terms that folks may have heard associated specifically with being autistic or having a cognitive disability, which is low functioning and high functioning. These terms can be replaced with low and high support needs with a caveat that it's important to still not describe a specific person with these things. So saying low or high support needs is something that a person with those support needs can use for themselves. Whereas from the side of a professional or caretaker or something of that nature, it should be more specific to what the support need actually is. Low and high support needs are still kind of terms that can imply things. Folks might think that if someone has low support needs, that means that they don't need help with dressing. And if they have high support needs, then they do, things like that, where that isn't necessarily always the case. So again, it's important to follow the lead of the person that you are caring for or in company with, because they may describe their needs as low for themselves, but for somebody else who with the same needs, they may describe them as high support needs. So it's really important to kind of follow their lead with that. Um, some other terms, things like insane, crazy, psychotic, and psycho, these things are often associated with folks who have a mental health disability, usually, a disability such as like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD, and certain personality disorders as well. And similar to the hard of hearing and deaf community, saying the blind is not useful anymore. Instead, we can exchange that for a person who is blind or low vision or has low vision. And again, back to the autistic community, folks may be familiar with hearing the term on a spectrum or a person with autism. And while those terms, have been traditionally used pretty frequently, especially by caretakers of autistic people, they aren't preferred in practice anymore, specifically because of the implications, again, with spectrum. A lot of folks think that the spectrum in terms of autism spectrum disorder is a linear spectrum, meaning that someone is more or less autistic. And that has been proven to be not true. It's more so like a pie chart is how I like to describe it, where each piece of the pie is a different autistic trait. And sometimes that pie may be bigger or smaller, or that slice of the pie might be bigger or smaller, depending on the person, the day, the person they're talking to, the environment. It can change, from day to day. So instead, we just say autistic person or neurodivergent person. If you're not familiar with that term, neurodivergent is really just any sort of brain wiring that is different from what is considered typical. So not only does that include, autism, ADHD, OCD, things like that, but also Tourette syndrome, epilepsy, really anything that has to do with the specific wiring of your brain. So that term can be used not just for autistic people, but for other folks who may have a disability that is similar. And then, we talked about different terms that might kind of imply helplessness or be patronizing. So, saying something like somebody is confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. One isn't always accurate because, again, not every wheelchair user is a full-time wheelchair user. But two is also, it is offensive. You can just say that they are a wheelchair user or that he, she, or they is in a wheelchair. That's appropriate as well. And then the final thing on this slide on this little chart is to use the term mental retardation or mentally retarded. Again, it's things that have been put into text and put into media and has been used pretty, even in like music and things like that. So it's pretty, it's not uncommon to have heard it or even to maybe have used it yourself in the past. But these terms are offensive, and now we are moving towards using intellectual or even cognitive disability is something that is new to me as well, that I'm trying to exchange intellectual disability for cognitive disability because it's a little bit more accurate. Okay, before I move on to these slides, are there any questions about language since those were a lot of slides all at once? Okay, no questions, and we'll move on. So etiquette and considerations. These are some just like quick things. Again, this is like barely scratches the surface of what should be considered when working with disabled folks. But first and foremost, always asking consent, especially when you're doing things like touching their body, touching a baby's body, trying to measure for nipple or flange sizes, trying to, assess for postpartum, anything, just making sure that you are explaining to the person that you're working with or in company with that, this is happening because XYZ. This is the reason why I need to look at XYZ part of your body, your baby's body, whatever the case is. And then making sure that they are okay with the process and understand what's going on and are consenting to that. And consent can look different. In the disabled community, there are folks who are either situationally mute or just mute altogether or communicate in sign language or things like that. So it's important to not just expect somebody to be able to speak with their consent. Something that I highlight a lot is because it pertains specifically to my experience of being autistic is that I do experience situational mutism, which means that there are points in time where I cannot speak at all, despite the fact that I love public speaking. And so when I'm in situations, especially when there's some sort of like a power exchange or dynamic, it can be difficult for me to be able to speak, or sometimes it's just not even possible. And this is a very common thing in the autistic community, especially I think about if you're working with like young parents who maybe even like, someone who's like in their early 20s or even younger, a teenage, parent, that they may not feel 100% comfortable or may not even be able to verbalize that they are consenting or are not consenting. So a really good practice would be to just have everything laid out either in writing or via alternate formats, which I'll talk about a little bit later down on the slide, so that somebody knows exactly what each visit is going to look like and allowing them to fully consent enthusiastically beforehand, whether that's, via texting, email, verbally, however it is that they communicate. And because it can also be kind of different or difficult right in the moment to say, yes, I'm okay with you checking my nipple size, but maybe they aren't actually, or maybe they didn't realize that that was going to be part of the appointment or, whatever the case is. So that's something to consider. Additionally, something about competence with disabilities. So regardless of if somebody discloses a disability or not, you have, or regardless of whether what type of disability, I'm sorry, that they disclose, always assume competence. So if somebody is expressing that they have a cognitive disability or they are autistic or they have OCD or something of that nature, always assume that they are competent, that they understand what's going going on, but check and confirm for understanding. A lot of times what happens when folks are working with somebody who is, autistic or has a cognitive disability, they assume that they don't understand certain things. They'll try to kind of talk to them like they would talk to a child. And this is something that I have experienced myself as an adult after disclosing that I'm autistic. Unfortunately, it's a very real reality for a lot of us. And it just comes from the stereotype that autistic people or people with cognitive disabilities, have the age of a 5-year-old or, et cetera. It's something that we hear a lot. And this is just not true. And so it's important to just assume that they are competent, that they can and do understand what you're saying or what you're asking of them, but just confirm that. And that also can go back to consent again, making sure that they know what's happening, when it's going to happen and how it'll happen, and making sure that they actually understand what's going on. Something that I always make sure to mention during my classes is about executive function or executive dysfunction. So, if you're not familiar with this, this is a term, executive dysfunction, is a term that's used a lot for folks who have a mental health disability such as depression, or even, in this situation, it could be postpartum depression, or those who are neurodivergent, so maybe autistic or have ADHD specifically are the main ones that experience this, although it's not exclusive. And this is the kind of phenomenon of just genuinely not being able to do something. So you want to do something. It's like, I'll put it into perspective. If you know that the dishes are piling up and you want to do them and you know you have to do them and you feel anxious that they're not done, but for whatever reason, the wiring in your brain is not allowing you to do that task. And it's so difficult. And it's different from, being quote lazy, which is another term that I don't even like to use because it is rooted in this kind of ableist idea that people just don't do things. It is not that. It is that no matter how hard you want to get up out of bed or get up off the couch, you just cannot because your brain will not let you. And this can be a hard concept for someone to understand if they've never experienced it. So if you haven't, you'll just have to take my word for it as somebody who has experienced it on a regular basis from as early as middle school is what I can remember. And it can impact how you care about your body, how you care for the people in your life, how you communicate with people, and especially in that postpartum period, if postpartum depression or anxiety is a factor, it can be very very difficult. We talk a lot about giving parents a break so they can shower and giving them a break so that they can eat, but sometimes it's not about having a break; it's about your brain just literally not letting you do that thing. And so having an understanding that executive dysfunction may be a very real aspect of what is happening postpartum or even prenatal is very, very important because it may impact how it is that they are taking in the information that you're giving to them, how you're caring for them. I'll give a personal example. The pregnancy that I just had with my twins was very complicated and very high risk. There was the shortening cervix, and then I was anemic, and then there was also just the fact that I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. And if you have, a base level understanding of pregnancy hormones, relaxin already kind of loosens up your tissues and your connective joints. So, it was all kind of just like mumbled up together. And it was very difficult for me to um uh, talk to my healthcare providers and send them in my glucose numbers because I'm also a diabetic. And so, going to those appointments and making sure that I was writing everything down was a lot to do on top of, having regular appointments in office for ultrasounds to make sure babies were okay. And I was also working full time and I also have a 5-year-old. So there's just like a lot of things going on. And it kind of gets to a point where you're like, okay, do I do the dishes or do I call my doctor? Do I take a shower or do I check my blood sugar? And it really is right down to like those tasks don't seem equal, but for somebody who is disabled, they very well could be. And that is because, especially if you have a chronic disability, so not just, I broke my leg ice skating, but like I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. If it's chronic and it's lifelong, you do really have to choose between do I eat or shower because you may not have the energy to do both. And so that's where an understanding of what executive function and dysfunction is really important for healthcare providers, especially for those who are working with pregnant people and postpartum as well. And then accessibility as far as offering things to the folks who are working with or in company with. So being prepared to offer learning material in other types of formats such as large print or bionic font, which if you are not familiar with, bionic font is on the screen what it looks like bolding the first couple of letters of a word. And this can help folks who are dyslexic or have ADHD be able to easier follow the print on the paper. Or you may have to offer things in Braille. You may need to have a video, a sort of a visual aid for information or materials. So a lot of folks get into a situation where they have a disabled, client or patient or something, and they change things after the fact. They realize, oh, I need this thing because somebody is disabled. And in this community and in my profession, we like to say that disabled people shouldn't just be accepted, but they should be expected. So you should expect that you will have disabled clients or participants in a class or patients who may need large print or bionic font or braille and just have those materials ready to go as it is. Those are things that are easy. Have an understanding that it may not always be easy to have something in a video format or audiobook. Those things are a little more specialized, but at the very least, having basic printed materials in large print, bionic font, and then having some sort of a partnership maybe with an external resource who can provide you with Braille or who can provide you with video trainings, things of that nature is always recommended. Okay. Any questions on that? That was a lot of content. I'll do a quick summary, but before I do summary and go to the next page, which is just my contact information, any question on those slides that I just went over? Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing anything. So we'll do a quick summary that competent lactation care in the disability community is especially hard to find. But when you arm yourself with knowledge of disability affirming and accessible practices, it can make a world of a difference for somebody. And it's more than just ramps and automatic doors. It's, about language and consent and attitudes and your policies. All of these things can be barriers to care for disabled people. So it's really important to, invest in taking courses like this one and others that are led by disabled people who have lived the experience and understand, best. A lot of times in the disabled community, we talk about how there are several doctors or, you have to go to several doctors before you finally get an accurate diagnosis. And the reality is that disabled people know disabled people best, and we know what we're experiencing and going through and having to deal with on a regular basis. So if we're saying that something is not working, it's not working. It's best to trust us and try to find a way to make it more accessible for us. And then that could be asking us, how do we do that? So that concludes my presentation. My social media and contact is here. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Please Call Me Kai. That's PLS. Call Me Kai, KY. Or email me either of my two emails, sweetnectarlactation@gmail.com or Kylia, which is my full first name, at autisticsunmasked.org. That's KYLIA, Kylia at autisticsunmasked.org. And that concludes my presentation. So I will also open for questions now, but I do know that I have a co-presenter, Amber, coming next. And I know that we'll take questions after Amber's presentation as well. So I will pass the mic over to Amber Wilkins.
Well, first, Kai, I do actually have a question. I think that would be best right now.
Sure.
That was an amazing presentation. Um, as someone who works with a lot of different lactating humans, if I don't have the lived experience of a certain disability, where can we get specific supports? Like I'm thinking, how do I typically help someone with positioning and latch? If they have a physical disability, that's really going to limit my go tos. Where do I find those resources? What about sensory overload? We often know that nipple to breast is going to be a lot of communication, but sometimes nipple shields could make or break. It's like my normal would be get off nipple shields. But if I'm working with someone with sensory overload, that might be the only way. Or maybe pumping is the only way because they can't take all of the fidgets. And I'm just wondering, can you share some resources for when we do have um, some of these people that come into our life that we might not have lived experience, but we want to be able to accommodate?
You know, this is a great question, and I wish I had a better answer for you. To my knowledge, right now, there is not one sort of place where we all exist. We're kind of just everywhere. That being said, if you are on Facebook, I know that there are several Facebook groups that I'll have to go back and find, and maybe I can send to Amber or Love afterwards, just a list of the Facebook groups that I know have lactation consultants within the Facebook group who are disabled and who do identify openly as such and have some information to share, some wealth of knowledge to share. But to my knowledge, there's no central place, which may just mean that someone has to make it, and maybe that person is me. So maybe more to follow on that at some point. But to your point also about, like especially like sensory overload, which is like a huge, huge thing, especially in the neurodivergent community and especially specifically the autistic community. Um, it is best to just follow their lead because it's not going to be the same across the board. In my book, I talk about there's a parent in there in particular who fed their baby with their finger and an SNS system taped to their finger for an entire year. And now specifically for them, it wasn't a sensory thing, but that could be a good alternative for somebody who does have a sensory aversion to just chest in general or having, using a nipple shield or anything of that nature, but maybe pumping is okay. So they can, pump and give it on, an SNS or even donor milk or formula if they choose to do that as well. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of just have to be creative with it. Like you really just have to be creative, especially because again, these traits are not the same across the board, and something that may be uncomfortable for one person may not really make a difference either way to another person. So I think there comes a point in a lot of lactation consultants' lives where they're like, okay, I'm learning that the best thing is to get off the nipple shield, but I'm understanding that for some people, this is the only way that they can do it. And if this is the only way they can do it and their goal is to do it, then this is how they're going to do it.
And I assume it's the same with being creative about physical differences, because I know you have to get very creative if someone is very large chested. That looks very different from someone who's small chested. So I can imagine. I like have a personal, it hasn't happened yet, but if I have worked with people that only have one functioning nipple, but what if they only have one functioning side? Like my brain is having a hard time. I
Yeah,
just
I
want to
mean,
be prepared. It's like what
it
you
gets
said. You don't want to be surprised. You want to expect.
Yep, and it is, and the best thing that I have done personally as a lactation consultant, who I kind of am cheating because I have my own babies to practice with, but is quite literally just like making up positions myself with my body and seeing what's comfortable for me or what could possibly be comfortable for someone else. So, as a lactation professional, if you don't have, a newborn on, on tap or whatever, get a baby doll and just put yourself in a bed, put yourself in a chair, put yourself on the floor and mimic the positions that you think you might put a parent in and see, is this something that somebody could do with, one arm on the opposite side of a functioning, chest or vice versa? Or is this something that somebody could do with, an amputated leg and et cetera? So it really is just like we go to school or we go and take classes and we learn like the logistical, like the, by the book, like here's how milk works, here's how, the postpartum works, here are the hormones, here are, XYZ. But when it comes to person and working with that individual parent, it really is just about like figuring out, okay, well, they look kind of uncomfortable. I'm showing them this position that I know I've used with other parents before, but they look just visibly uncomfortable. So let's try asking them, what side of your body feels most comfortable to be on? What side of your body do you feel like works better? However you want to word it. And just getting creative about it. But I think that be having some sort of awareness within your own body of different positions that could work again by using a doll or something of that nature is a really good place to start because you may think of positions that you've never would have thought of otherwise and just kind of playing around with it like use your body as a jungle gym and grab a baby doll and just kind of play around and let that be a way for you to learn yourself before trying to bring it to somebody else.
Thank you for that.
We do have a comment in the chat. It says, I always remember to ask the individual what is working for you and what is not working. Whether stroke or autism or sensory issues, we disabled people are experts in our own experiences.
Absolutely. Yep, that couldn't be more true. I just recently met with an IBCLC for my own personal journey with my twins because that is vastly different from feeding a singleton, especially because they both had oral ties and it just was a whole thing. So, she was showing me some different positions that I could, either tandem nurse them or, whatever the case was. And I remember her, having me sit up back in my chair, in my like recliner and having my knees like propped up. But because of having Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, my hips naturally turn out this way. They're not like so square. And she kept trying to have me have my hips just like square to support both of my babies. And I was like, I can't, my hips won't do that. So I've got to have them kind of turned out like that. And it ended up being much more comfortable for me because I can essentially, have them all the way out and have my babies supported that way as opposed to straight up and down. And I kept trying, kept telling her like, hey, this isn't working for me because my hips just they don't do that and they just naturally fall out and that's how they're most comfortable because I'm hypermobile. And so yeah, absolutely. We know our body is best, so asking who you're working with how they're feeling in their body is going to be immediately like your first line of defense and key for situations like that.
Awesome. This has been a great conversation. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, Amber Cruz. Born and raised amidst the verdant landscapes of North Carolina, Amber Cruz has always been a spirited advocate for first food equity. She stands firm in the belief that every child deserves access to human milk, and her endeavors in the field speaks volumes about her commitment. Amber's years in Washington, D.C. have enriched her perspective, intertwining her Southern roots with the vibrancy of urban life. As an active Lay Leche League leader, Amber extends support, guidance, and encouragement to new parents, helping them navigate the intricacies of breastfeeding. Her empathetic nature combined with her her empathetic nature combined with her enterprise expertise makes her a trusted source of counsel in the world of lactation support. In her role as the chair of the Breastfeed Durham's LGBTQ+ Human Milk Feeding Coalition, Amber wears her advocacy on her sleeve. She tirelessly works towards ensuring that the LGBTQ+ community receives equal opportunities and backing in the domain of human milk feeding. A mama, a maker, and an advocate for all things human milk, her wife and her daughter are her biggest cheerleaders in this important work. And let me pull up your slides. There they are. And I'll turn it over to you, Amber.
Perfect. Thanks. Mine will be a little more of a lived experience, but spoiler alert, having a baby also got me on my own advocacy journey. And so much of what Kai was talking about is also true for the LGBTQ plus community. So language, feeling expected in a space, feeling honored and believed for your experience, your pronouns, your family dynamic. My daughter was born in 2017 outside DC. And even then, not even then, I mean, we see the news, guys. Assumed that I have a husband, assume there's a father, just a lot of assumptions that can immediately make you feel unsafe in a doctor's office or whatever. And that was in DC. So just imagine what some of our queer folks, I'm calling in from North Carolina. So in the more rural counties in the state, right, there's lots of spaces where human milk and the different ways to get human milk are not even talked about. I chose to carry a child. And I always start with this is because I had this desire to body feed, but I know now that I could have adopted and body fed. That's kind of part of my advocacy is that a lot of us queer folks are never told what we can do. We're never told that there are these different options. I was never told that my wife could co-lactate. Now, I think for various reasons, we probably would have chosen not to, but it would have been nice to know that we could have. So that's part of my advocacy work here is to talk with everybody I can, and especially people in this field, to be more educated on options of human milk for different bodies because it's not as readily talked about. So this is my personal journey that has led me 7 years later to my advocacy space. So you can go to the next slide. So I was really committed to an out of hospital birth. We did not know gender. The baby was breech at 37 weeks, so I had an ECV. I don't know if any of you guys have gone through cephalic versions. They're terrible, but we were successful. And then she was late, so I was working with midwives outside of DC, and they had given me the 42-week mark because then they would have transferred me to a hospital. So we did all kinds of things to get this baby ready. And like by a day, we convinced her to come out. And so I had my out of hospital birth. It went just like the birthing class. She latched, like that's the first latch right there. My wife caught it. So they latched. And then I had a retained placenta, and I was in a birth center and I was unmedicated. So I had a manual removal of my placenta, which puts birth, like if birth, the manual removal was like a 20 if birth was a 10. Like it was intense. But I bring that up to say, because I was out of hospital, I was able to keep this newborn on my chest. So if the midwives hadn't been able to perform that manual removal, as painful as it was, I would have been transferred, would have been put under for an emergency D&C, like all of that stuff. And even before I gave birth, I already knew because I had read some Ina May stuff. She wrote things in the 70s, and I had read Lactation League's Womanly Art of Breastfeeding. I just knew that the way you gave birth affected how you nursed, and it was one of my main reasons, really, for giving birth. So I was committed. And we were home 4 hours later, and my milk, y'all, if you're in lactation, was in within 24 hours. So not just a little bit, like, and partially it was because this child did not leave my body. And that also was like the next year of my life. This child just would not be on my body. So we had lots of milk really fast. And so I now work with a lot of lactating humans, and it, yes, it's very stressful when you are having supply issues, when you're not making enough milk. And sometimes those of us who produce too much milk can get a little scoffed, like, oh, I'd love to have that problem, or oh, that's so lucky of you. But what you may not know is pretty severe oversupply can be just as dangerous as undersupply, just as far as getting enough, not enough in your baby, but it just comes out as a fire hose. They're getting a lot of that for milk. It just caused a lot of GI distress for this newborn. And we had to go to all of the Lilette 2-week meetings, hire all the lactation consultants. I did all the block feeding, and I still had pretty severe oversupply for a good 12 months. So then that was kind of my life, but I was really committed. So my interest in chest feeding was early, and then my needing help to make it happen was early. And that's a big theme that we were also talking about, is that so often this is not possible without help, and not only help with your family members, whether you have a spouse or family that can help, but professional help. And if you don't have the funds, if you don't have the insurance, if you don't know where to go, there's just so many places that this help can be blocked. So if you'll go to the next slide. So this is where even more help comes in, and I'm so glad that Kai had mentioned mental health. I don't think that we can talk about human milk feeding without talking about mental health. And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's a lot of things. I'm sure it's the hormones and it's the sleep deprivation. It's going to push you. But I also think so many of us already had mental health stuff, and then having a baby just makes it a more, right? It just makes it more. So throughout all this, at 3 months, I had a rather acute anxiety attack that lasted 10 days. I didn't sleep again with the not functioning. I was getting all the help I could. I was talking to the midwives. And long story short, we ended up in the ER outside of DC. And that was probably the first time that it really got me on my advocacy boat for how badly they treated me as a lactating person who was needing help. So after hours and hours, and they wanted to separate my baby from me right away because it was cold and flu season, and they just wouldn't understand that no, this child does not get separated from me. Like it just, she was still sleeping on me at that point. Like there was no not on me. And I think they don't believe you when you say that. They just think that you're, I don't know, making it up. So here, my wife and my daughters follow me into the ER. Since I'm having mental health issues, they put a suicide watcher in the room, actually, like all of this stuff. We waited a super long time, talked to people, and the only way they would help me is if I did an abrupt weaning. They would not help with anything unless I did an abrupt weaning right then. So after staying up all night, we just walked right out of the ER. And luckily, my midwives were able to get me into a psychiatrist who specializes in maternal mental health. And so that also made me realize, wow, people need to know more. Here I am, a 33-year-old first time mother struggling. And in the middle of it, I'm like, wait a minute, there's a specialist right here that's telling me that I can have help, when the ER said the only way I could get help is if I did abrupt weaning. Um, and so that's also, as a Leche leader too, there's still a stigma. 2024, there's plenty of stigmas around needing mental health, psychiatric support, and wanting to also lactate and feed your baby human milk. And there's just research that's coming out every day that's saying that if you know what you're doing and you work with someone who really knows you, there's a lot that can be done. And I think what helped change my mind is when one of my psychiatrists said, an old assumption is that if you don't take this medicine, you're at a zero risk. But what they're finding out is that unmedicated mental health crisis isn't a zero risk either to your unborn child or to your actual child. It's not a zero risk. And so you can't just do a base sum like that. And so that really helped me. And so I will talk to anybody, we can't give medical advice, but to find someone that specializes in maternal mental health, that believes you, that wants to work with you. And people just, there were times where, like, okay, as soon as the baby goes to sleep, take X medicine, because by the time they wake up in 4 hours, 70% is going to be gone anyway. So there's people who can work with you. And I couldn't have done it without. So here's another big check mark on that goal to feed my child human milk, is if I hadn't found that psychiatrist that worked with mental health, something would have happened. I either would have done direct weaning and done an inpatient something, or something would have had to change, because it was that bad. And as I work with more and more parents, I realize it can be that bad for a lot of us, and we don't talk about it. So I like to talk about it. And 7 years later, I still work with a great psychiatrist, and it hasn't magically gone away. So I also like to give voice to this narrative that we often have, that if we are on mental health medication, it means we're less than. So the goal should always be to get off of it. And I'm now part of my journey that I'm no longer, that's not a goal of mine. Um, and again, I think it's in line with some of what Kai was discussing about owning who you are, what you have to work with, and the supports you need. So I think maybe it's not talked about enough in the world of lactation. And I think specifically in LGBTQ plus lactation, we have to consider mental health as far as gender dysphoria, body dysphoria. When we say, oh, you need to have support, just get your family. Well, I, for one, have none, right? So that is a reality for a lot of us queer folks, especially in the South, that we chose partners over shitty family. So our chosen family can look different. So that got us through infanthood. I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so then that high needs baby turned into a super high needs toddler, and then the pandemic hit. So I was one of those that had an only child who was 2, undiagnosed everything. And the pandemic hit, and they closed the parks, y'all. They closed the libraries. They closed the La Leche League meetings. They closed all the places that I found solace. And even though it was definitely trying at times, if I was still not nursing, I don't know how I would have done it. And these pictures are here because this is what I looked like all the time. Um, she also didn't really sleep. So that was one of our earliest signs of her neurodivergence, is that she would only sleep in about hour and a half chunks, all the way until about a year ago, and she's almost 7. So I also operated on kind of chronic sleep deprivation, but I always told people who didn't know lactation, they would often say, oh, well, it's because you nurse that she keeps waking up. And I would just look at them and say, y'all, if I didn't nurse, she'd never go back down. Because sometimes she wouldn't at 3, even with the boob, and then we're up for the day. And she also never napped unless she was held. So she stopped naps at about 3.5 when I stopped holding her. And so also working with people and believing them, not always. I loved what Kai said is believe the people you're working with. If they say this child doesn't nap unless they're held, don't think it's because they didn't try. Don't think it's because they didn't have blackout shades or a sound machine. If you've not slept for 3 years, I guarantee you have bought everything on Amazon to try to make that happen. So if it's not happening, something else is going on. And so, in my own advocacy and my own lactation support, I just really want to be that voice of, I believe you, tell me what's going on. Because when you're in it, sometimes you can't see the broader picture. And so sometimes as professionals, we can help connect dots. And it was a fellow La Leche League person who said, hey, have you Googled sensory processing disorder? I'm about 3. And then we got on a wait list for the OT. And then she's been in OT ever since. And right now it's actually looking like OCD maybe. I'm I mean, she's only 6.5. They keep telling me it's not autism, but mamas know, right? So like high verbal, high masking, 6.5-year-old female. We've had 2 different people say, no, it's just anxiety, maybe OCD. I'm like, yeah, but where's the anxiety coming from, y'all? She didn't sleep for 6 years. So that's also just a shout out to us parents raising these kids in a system that doesn't necessarily put people first and put lived experience first, right? Like I'll spend 3 hours filling out surveys for my kid, and then I'll spend 1 hour with her and say, oh, well, she makes eye contact. She's good. I'm like, guys, we can be better. So that is where we are. And I think one more slide. Yeah, this is our last slide. So I didn't even pull pictures when she was older because she started So again, as a La Leche League leader, always seeking out lactation-friendly spaces, she was a frequent and often nurser all the way until she was almost 6. And even though I never ever said anything, around 5, she started looking around and not wanting to nurse in public and not wanting to nurse in front of her friends and not wanting me to take pictures of her, because I always thought it was this beautiful thing that basically saved us for so many years. These are professional photographs. I always wanted to remember and celebrate this time. And so it was so interesting to me that that was protected within the family, but society still got to her. And it's her, she's just very highly sensitive. And so I would say it was 90% self-weaned, and then it was like that last 10% right before she was 6. Like there was no more milk happening here, and so it was just a sensory experience. So then I cut it off and still grieved. I didn't think I'd grieve after, like, a lot of my other friends had stopped nursing years before that. But that was still a grief. The first La Leche League meeting I led as a non-lactating parent. Like I cried halfway through. And she still sleeps with us, and she has a very close relationship with my breasts. And we're getting to the age now where we have to start talking about consent and how, like, sometimes I feel accosted by her roaming hands, but she's also 6. And I think part of her still thinks that my body's her body. So that's where we are in that journey. And I'd love to leave the last 20 minutes for questions, but I would just leave this community with so much of what Kai said too is applicable to the LGBTQ plus community. Is take time before to research language and not make assumptions on who's the parent, who's the father. Use terms that they're using for themselves, whether it's terms that they're using for their role with the baby, terms they're using for their own body parts. 100% ask consent for anything, for especially touching, seeing, anything, because so much of our community has had boundaries crossed physically. And just to be a voice for information. One of my biggest roles with Breastfeed Durham's LGBTQ plus coalition has been amassing resources on our website that are both national and local for our queer families to trust and be able to go to one place and find a lactation consultant that we already know is queer friendly. But that's only a tip of the iceberg. It's just to know your network and know when something is outside your field, to know who to refer them to, and especially with mental health stuff. And again, like, we as lactation helpers, consultants, whatever you are, can get stuck in this is how you breastfeed and these are the words you use. And it can be very easy to shut somebody off who maybe doesn't feel that way about their chest, is maybe it's really hard for them, or they really want to create human milk. They thought they'd try latching the first few times, it just didn't work. And we can get in the way if we start judging. Oh, maybe you're a pumper. And I think sometimes, especially with the Leche League, we can get caught sometimes of almost being afraid to say, well, pumping was fine. So thank you for having me here. I can be here to answer anything that's more LGBTQ specific, but I'd love to open it up for questions about both of our presentations.
Thank you, Amber. I did have a question. Would you mind talking a little bit more about the La Leche League and what they do?
Oh, yeah. So La Leche League is actually one of the forefront in lactation peer-to-peer consulting. It's like the biggest peer-to-peer consulting network. It's international. It's not almost every country. Durham's La Leche League, we have maybe 8 or 9 members. We have a very big La Leche League leader presence here in the Triangle, and it's completely free. We do a lot of training, but the training is also free, and it's a peer to peer. So all of us leaders have lactated, like fed a child for 12 months or more. So it's a lived experience. And we can kind of meet that because we're free, we can be an in between sometimes. And we will often outsource to lactation consultants if they are needing like daily support, but we can take texts and calls. And we also host monthly meetings, some virtual. I do the third Thursday in person here in Durham. And so it can also be a socializing community around. It was like the first place I nursed out of the house was at a Lactation meeting. Even though it was a cafe, I felt like, look, there's other boobs out. I can do it. Right. So it can be, for some of us, the first place we feel comfortable talking about what it's like feeding our babies and knowing that the first thing out of someone else's mouth is not going to be, oh, it's hard, just wean, because so many of our families might be like that if they're not personal advocates of human milk feeding. Your mother-in-law might be like, well, I bottle fed all my kids, they're fine. So the Leche League can be that good, safe social space where you can just share, how was your month? And some of my best friends have come out of the Leche League.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Guys, if you do have a question, please feel free to come off mute and ask. This is the time for you all to get your questions out for either Kai or Amber.
Can you hear me? I would like to make a comment to Kai. She talked about executive function and being autistic. I have a daughter who has several aspects of autism, but not the diagnosis because they said she didn't have enough. But she's also been diagnosed with executive function issues. And I now understand executive function more because of what Kai was talking about. And I really appreciate that you mentioned that. And I'm thinking because she also has arthrogryposis, which is connective tissues diseases, that she may have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome also. So this has been really an eye-opening talk with you, Kai. So I really appreciate um, what you have told us about yourself. It leaves me with more information and more understanding of my daughter. Thank you.
I'm so happy to hear that. So thank you for sharing. If you would like, I can give to Amber Wilkins. My nonprofit has a resource that we call our assessment guide, and it is a very comprehensive guide that kind of breaks down the process of getting a clinical autism diagnosis, if that's something that you want to pursue for your daughter, if your daughter wants to pursue for herself. So it's a free guide. It's downloadable as a PDF. It's about 26 pages long, I believe, and it just kind of goes through the different characteristics and the different routes that you can take to get a clinical diagnosis if that's something that you want to do, as well as some trusted professionals who are neurodivergent friendly, who may be more inclined to diagnose somebody who is higher masking or who is socialized as a girl, because it is more difficult for us to get diagnosed.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yes.
Absolutely. I can send that to Amber tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. I was saying after Kai sends it to me, I can post it for everyone and it'll be in your My AHEC account. So you'll be able to access it along with Kai's presentation. Well, hearing no more questions and seeing no more questions in the chat, I think it would be okay to go ahead and close it out now. In about 24 hours, everybody who attended today should be receiving an email for your course evaluation. And once you complete your course evaluation, you'll have access to your certificate of completion. If you have any questions about your attendance, the course evaluation, or the certificate of completion, you can give me an email or you can shoot me an email at amber.wilkins@conehealth.com. Again, that's amber.wilkins@conehealth.com. And that's for any questions around attendance, certificates of completion, or your evaluation. I hope you all have a great rest of your evening and a great rest of your week.